Puppy got trapped inside a cardboard box in a big cold front, and he closed his eyes thinking it was the end. But then a miracle happened. Have you wondered what it must be like to feel the cold not just on your skin, but in your soul? That cold that can't be with an extra coat or a sip of hot coffee, but that seems to pass through the body and freeze even the simplest emotions. It's exactly that kind of cold that enveloped the little dog on that freezing winter morning in Minnesota. Winter had arrived with a vengeance, covering city in a thick blanket of snow, transforming familiar streets into desolate landscapes. The sharp wind blew relentlessly, like small blades touching everything in their path. The sidewalks were empty, cars were rushing by, their closed windows insulating the heat from who could protect themselves. But for him there was no protection. There, next to a rusty dumpster on a street, sat a cardboard box warped by the humidity, its edges torn and fragile against the weight of the snow that was to accumulate. To any inattentive person, it was just another piece of discarded insignificant amid the freezing chaos of the city. But inside her, there was a life silently fighting not to. The puppy was huddled in a corner of the box, trying to make its small body disappear, as if it could hide the cold and loneliness. The fur, dirty and tangled, no longer offered any protection against the freezing wind that whistled the gaps in the box. Its thin bones outlined taut skin, a raw portrait of and neglect. But what hurt most wasn't the visible wounds, it was the emptiness in his eyes. The cub's eyes, once bright and were now dull, as if time and suffering had stolen all the spark of hope. They no longer begged for help. There was no more energy for hope. That instinct that normally shines bright even in the darkest moments seemed to surrender to the cold. He was shaking, but it wasn't just the cold that made his body shake. It was the fear, the hunger, the despair of understanding why he had been left there alone in a dirty box, with nothing but a thin layer of cardboard between him and the winter. The cold was more than a temperature. It was a presence. An invisible entity seeped into the bones and soul. Time for him seemed to have stopped. The day dawned slowly. Each second, dragged by the pain of his empty stomach, hurt as much as the cold that burned his pores, now stiff and insensitive. He no longer remembered last time he felt the warm touch of a hand, the comforting sound of a soft voice. All that existed now was silence, broken by faint moans that barely penetrated the freezing air. The world outside remained indifferent. People hurried past, protected by thick coats gloves, their footsteps echoing on the ice without even noticing that small cardboard box. Because for many, abandonment in common places, invisible to the eyes of those who are too busy to really look. And yet he resisted, not by choice, but by a primitive that whispered, even if quietly, continue. It was a silent struggle between the weak body and the little life that still every breath was an effort, every heartbeat reminder that despite everything, he was still there. The cold is unforgiving. He makes no distinctions. He has no mercy. It invades, and little by little erases what it finds. But the cold doesn't understand things that can't be measured in degrees, things like hope, resilience, the power of a simple look to meet another and say, "You matter." And on that freezing morning, when the puppy no longer had the strength to keep its eyes open, fate decided to intervene, not with a grand miracle, but with the subtle sound of footsteps, steps that could go straight by like so many others. But this time they would stop, because sometimes all that needs to be saved is someone who decides to look inside a cardboard box. Have you ever stopped to think about how a simple can change someone's destiny? That's exactly what made the difference for little Luke. Maybe, just this story touched your heart, it can touch other people's too. Now you can be part of it. Like the video and subscribe to the channel so that stories of hope and overcoming find those who need to hear them. And tell me in the comments, what defines how you felt about this story? Write resilience if Luke inspired you to believe that, even in the most times, there is always a chance to start over. Have you ever stopped to think about how deafening silence can be? Not the kind of silence we find in a peaceful place, but one that carries pain, abandonment, and an emptiness so deep that it seems to fill all the around it. It was in this kind of silence that little Luke was trapped. As the wind whistled the icy streets of Minnesota, whipping everything in its path, there was a sound that was almost lost among the crunching of beneath the hurried footsteps of the few people who dared to leave their homes. A hoarse, broken sound, an almost imperceptible groan. It was the kind of sound that anyone could mistake for the creak of a frozen structure or the of a forgotten plastic bag, but it wasn't. It was a cry help disguised as a whisper. Inside the cardboard box, now almost covered by a thin layer of snow, Luke tried to fight against what inevitable. The cold was no longer a simple discomfort. It was a presence that invaded every cell in his body. What little heat he still had left. Its small paws were stiff, muscles frozen from lack of proper circulation. He tried to bark, but there was no more. The air entering his lungs felt sharp, as if the very act of breathing was too painful an effort. Luke's body instinctively seeking heat that didn't exist in that tight, damp space. He pressed himself against the sodden cardboard, trying to find of what it was like to feel hot. But the cold was everywhere, outside and now inside. It wasn't just the cold of winter, it was the of abandonment, of loneliness, of the absence of a touch, of a voice that said he wasn't alone. His half-closed, still tried to focus on something beyond the darkness. But what he saw was only the inside of the box, with its fragile walls that hemmed from the world outside, a world that seemed to have forgotten his existence. And yet, he didn't give up. The weak moan escaped his throat wasn't just a reflection of physical pain. It was a last attempt to be heard, to remind the world that he was still. As the ice crunched beneath hurried, indifferent footsteps, Luke remained in his small makeshift prison, his beating slower by the minute, but the heart was still beating, weak but persistent, as if saying, "It's not over yet." Outside, the world to spin. People hurried past, protected by layers of warm clothing, focused on their own routines. No one imagined that, hidden inside a cardboard box, there was a life hanging by a thread, and it was this thread, invisible to so many, that continued to hold Luke, but resistant. The cold stole more than heat. It stole energy, hope, even the memory of what it was like to feel safe. No longer remembered the touch of gentle hands, the sound of a loving voice calling his name. All that was left was the present, a cold, dark, silent, and yet there was a sound, that weak, insistent, stubborn moan, a sound that, even though it was almost extinguished, refused to disappear. It was the materialization of hope, even when everything seemed lost. The wind continued to blow, spreading the snow like a veil the city, but amid this frozen landscape, there was a story unfolding, invisible to those who weren't willing to look. Listen. Luke's almost silent sound was more than a cry for help. It was a declaration of resistance. While he fought, fate moved outside, because sometimes you just need someone to hear what no one else is hearing. Have you ever felt that strange that you need to stop, even when everything around you tells you to keep going? An instant when the heart whispers, then logic, and something invisible pulls you towards something you can't yet see. That's exactly what happened to that freezing morning. The clock ticked the end of another exhausting shift at the hospital. Emily, a young nurse to intense routines, crossed the snow-covered streets, her face hidden under her scarf, her hands stuffed in her coat pockets to protect from the biting cold. The city was silent, broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant noise rushing cars. She just wanted to get home, take a hot shower and rest. But, in the midst of ordinary winter scene, there was something that made Emily slow down. It wasn't a loud sound or a flashy movement. It was a sensation, of those intuitions that appear without explanation, the kind of thing we normally ignore, but this time she couldn't. His eyes were drawn to seemingly insignificant, a crumpled cardboard box, lying next to a dumpster half covered in snow. She could have kept walking. Everyone else had done. After all, it was just an old box with nothing special about it. But there was something about her, or maybe around her, that Emily's attention in a way she couldn't explain. She stopped. He stayed there for a few, staring at the object, the vapor of his own breath mixing with the cold air. Why did that box look different? Emily's quickened in a strange way, a silent restlessness that seemed to scream louder than the wind. Maybe it was the instinct she had developed over years, caring for people in critical situations. Maybe it was the quick glance she took at the box, and a subtle detail, a small tear in the cardboard, and for a brief second, what appeared to be imperceptible movement inside. Without thinking twice, she walked over to the box. The sound of her own footsteps sinking into the cold felt even more intense now, but something inside her burned with urgency. Emily knelt, her sinking into the ice, and with her hands shaking, whether from the cold or anticipation, she lifted the lid of the box. What she saw made the air feel even more biting, as if winter itself had sunk its claws into her chest. Inside, huddled in a corner of the wet, cardboard box, was Luke, a fragile, dirty puppy, covered in a thin layer of ice that stuck to its thin, now dull fur. His body was shaking, but it wasn't the usual cold kind of shaking. It was an involuntary spasm, the last reflex of a body fighting imminent collapse. Half-closed eyes seemed dulled by exhaustion and pain. There was an emptiness there, the kind of emptiness that doesn't belong to puppies, who be running, playing, experiencing the world with curiosity and joy. But not Luke. His look was that of someone who had already seen too much, felt much, and was now on the verge of giving up. Still, when light burst through the box's opening, he tried. From somewhere inside, he found a tiny of energy. His head felt heavy, but he tried to lift it. Such a small effort, but it seemed to carry the weight of the world. Emily, her heart tightened in a way she had never felt before. It was a real physical tightness, as if the chest was being compressed from the inside. She had already seen a lot in her routine as a nurse. She had already dealt with emergency, with pain and human suffering. But this was different. It was raw. It was unfair. It was a life that was silently away, alone, invisible to the world. The puppy breathed with difficulty, his chest rising and falling irregularly, as each breath was an almost insurmountable challenge. The paws were stiff, frozen, small cracks visible in the dry, bruised skin. The ribs stuck out the thin skin, marking the outline of prolonged hunger, neglect, abandonment. He tried to make a sound, perhaps a bark, a cry for a last attempt to be noticed, before disappearing forever. But what came out was a hoarse, broken moan, almost a whisper, a weak sound, but of despair. It wasn't just physical pain. It was a silent scream of someone who hadn't completely given up yet, a thin thread of hope fighting to break. Emily felt tears burning her eyes, not from the cold but from the impact of the scene. It was the type of that takes root in the memory, impossible to uproot. She wanted to scream. She wanted to understand how something like this could, how such a small, defenseless being had been condemned to such a cruel fate. But there was no for questions. There was no room for shock. She reached out with trembling hands and picked him up, as carefully as if he were made of. Luke's body was cold, lacking the heat that should exist in living creature. His touch on her hands was too light, too fragile. It was the weight of a life hanging by Emily brought him close to her chest, feeling the painful contrast between her own body heat and the deadly that dominated the little cub. She could feel his heart beating, weak, slow, giving up, and it was at that moment that she knew no matter what happened she wouldn't let him die. Because sometimes what saves a life isn't a heroic act, it's simply the fact that someone finally stopped to look. Have you ever found yourself your breath without realizing it, as if the simple act of breathing could change the outcome of a situation? That's how Emily felt as she rushed into the veterinary clinic, with Luke fragile and inert in her arms. The heat of his own body seemed insignificant, the cold that still gripped the little cub, and the fear was so intense that it seemed to freeze the air him. The sound of the clinic door opening echoed through the empty lobby, and within seconds, the Dr. Harris, an experienced veterinarian with years of working in emergency situations, rushed over upon hearing the in Emily's voice. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. His clinical gaze captured what was happening in seconds, the cub on the verge of collapse. Emily could barely explain what had happened. The words came out broken by the panic and raw emotion that dominated. What mattered now was saving Luke. Doctor Harris picked up the puppy with extreme, taking it to the exam room, while nurses and assistants mobilized quickly, as if every second was a fraction hope. The bright clinical atmosphere of the room felt cold, but no colder than Luke's body. He was inert, painful to the frantic movement around him. Dr. Harris placed the small body on the metal table, the sound of contact echoing softly, a reminder of fragile he was. The stethoscope found her tiny breast, and for an instant time seemed to stop. The diagnosis was devastating. Severe extreme dehydration and signs of chronic malnutrition, said Dr. Harris bluntly, but with a gentleness that made it clear how serious the was. He exchanged a quick look with Emily, a look that said everything words couldn't. The we're slim. Emily felt the world spin for a moment. The heart tightened, as if it were shrinking along Luke's small body. She approached the table, her eyes fixed on him, fighting not to let despair take over. The cubs rose and fell irregularly, each breath a visible effort, as if the air itself was fighting against him. Dr. Harris began emergency immediately. Thermal blankets were placed over the cub, trying to warm up the cold body. An intravenous catheter was inserted gently to administer warm serum and electrolytes. The team adjusted the oxygen flow, while monitoring vital signs. Fragile, they seemed to disappear at any moment. Emily stayed by the table the entire. She held her breath with every flicker in the monitors, with every irregular beep that indicated Luke's heart was to keep going. In a moment he gave a small sigh, a faint sound, but one that made her heart with hope. But fear soon came, because that sigh could be both a sign of recovery and a last sigh of farewell. The silence the room was broken only by Dr. Harris and the sound of medical equipment. Emily gripped the edge of the table tightly, knuckles white, so much tension. Every look at Luke was a blow to the chest. His eyes were half open but empty, as if they were about to close forever. Harris paused for a moment, assessing the cub's reactions. He shook his head slightly, his gaze serious but determined. "He's fighting," he said in low voice, as if he didn't want the air itself to hear the gravity of the situation. "But we need to be realistic. His is failing him." Those words hit Emily like a blade. She felt a tear slip silently, hot against the cold of her face. But as she looked at Luke, inside her refused to accept the worst. He was still there, still breathing, still fighting. Then she got even closer, gently placed her hand on the body and whispered, "You're not alone anymore, Luke. I'm here, and I won't leave you." Her touch seemed insignificant, the face of so much medical technology around, but in that instant, it was as if a spark of had been ignited. The heart monitor showed a slight change, a small increase in rhythm. It wasn't a miracle, but it was an A sign. Emily remained there, speaking softly, telling Luke about the world he could yet know, about soft grass under his paws, sunny and gentle hands that would caress him without pain, each word a thread of hope sewn to the puppy's weak breathing. "Doctor," Harris continued with precision and focus, but even he knew, sometimes what keeps a life hanging by a thread isn't medicine or machines. It's in love that someone refuses to let go, and at that moment, even with the devastating diagnosis, Emily decided that Luke would have more than he would have one promise, that he would never be abandoned again. Would Luke survive this terrible? Leave a comment saying, "Force Luke if you believe in the power of love to transform and heal an animal." Have you lived in a moment when silence seems so heavy that any sound, no matter how small, carries the weight of the world? It was exactly like that cold room at the veterinary clinic, where time seemed to have stopped, frozen between the slow ticking of the heart and Luke's ragged breathing. Hours had passed since Emily brought him in her arms. Her heart squeezed hope and fear that perhaps she had arrived too late. Luke's small body remained motionless on the examination table, wrapped in blankets that seemed useless in the face of the cold coming from inside him, the cold of abandonment, of loneliness, of almost death. The dripped slowly, trying to rehydrate what was left of his strength, while oxygen was administered through a small tube, a desperate attempt to give tired lungs a reason to keep working. Emily was there the whole time, unable to get away. Fatigue weighed heavily on his, but the idea of leaving him alone didn't even cross his mind. She held his little paw between her fingers, an almost gesture because the paw was cold and unresponsive. But for Emily, that touch was everything, a silent promise that she wouldn't abandon him. Harris, experienced in handling difficult cases, maintained a controlled expression, but even he knew the situation was critical. There was silence in the room, the kind of silence that speaks more than words. Emily watched Luke's chest rise and fall so subtly that sometimes held her breath, fearing that the next inhale simply wouldn't come. And then, when expected the worst, the impossible happened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a slight movement, a blink so faint it could have gone. But Emily was there, watching every detail, and in that microsecond she saw. Luke's eyes opened. If only she didn't believe it right away. The heart raced, the eyes filled with tears. "Dr. Harris," her voice was low, almost a whisper. He approached quickly, his serious gaze changing to something Emily had never seen before. Surprise. The kind of surprise that comes when you something that defies all odds. Luke tried to breathe deeper. It was a faint sigh, almost a whisper of life. It was there. His chest rose a little higher than before, and for a moment the sound of the heart monitor changed. A little jump, a stronger rhythm. Harris leaned over, listened to the heartbeat with his stethoscope, and then looked at Emily with a sparkle in his eyes that hadn't appeared before. "Wants to live, and we're going to help him." These words broke the ice in Emily's soul. She cried, not of sadness but of relief, of hope, of love for that little being who, even with everything against him, decided to fight. The rhythm in the room changed. Now there was a new energy, urgency filled with hope. Dr. Harris and his team adjusted the equipment, increased the temperature of the thermal blankets, reinforced the serum, continued to hold Luke's paw, but now with the feeling that he was holding it back, even if invisibly. From that moment on, every little bit of felt like a miracle. A stronger sigh, a subtle movement of the tail, every heartbeat was a silent victory, a reminder that even all seems lost, life can surprise. Emily whispered to him, her voice choked with emotion, "You are a warrior, Luke, and I am with you until the end." And deep down she knew that this wasn't the end, it was the beginning, the first sign that against all odds, Luke chosen to stay, and she would do anything to make sure he knew it was worth fighting for. Have you ever noticed how sometimes life's biggest are fought in silence? It was like that with Luke. After that faint sigh that ignited a spark of a new journey began, no less challenging than the first, but now with a fundamental difference. He was longer alone. The first few days were critical. Every minute seemed like an eternity. The veterinary led by Dr. Harris monitored Luke closely, adjusting the serum, regulating the temperature, and controlling every beat of his little heart. Luke was in a kind of limbo between fragility and strength, as if each was a conscious decision to continue. But there was something about Luke that inspired everyone around him. It was a silent will to live, that didn't need words. He began to respond to care in subtle but undeniable ways. First, a slight movement of the tail when Emily spoke to him. A deeper sigh as he felt the warmth of her hands. Small gestures that, to anyone looking in from the outside, might seem insignificant, but to Emily, the clinic team, they were daily miracles. Emily couldn't stay away from him. The bond that began with a quick rescue on the street now every day. She visited Luke every day after work, often tired, but always with her heart of a new energy she didn't even know existed. She would sit next to him, hold his little paw and whisper words of, "You're strong, Luke, you're doing well, I'm here and I'm not going to leave you." And somehow, Luke to understand. His eyes, which had previously been dull and empty, began to gain shine again. He recognized Emily's voice, her scent, and it was if that was the most powerful medicine he could receive. The day he accepted the first drops of water and small amounts of food was as a great victory. It was a simple act of survival, but also a gesture of Luke was saying in his own way that he wanted to stay. With each visit, Emily realized that the bond between them was not just of a caregiver and a rescued animal. It was something deeper. There was a silent connection, in the exchange of glances, in the gentle touches, in the moments when she simply stood in silence next to him, offering the kind of company that beyond words. As Luke recovered, surrounded by care and love, the veterinary team decided to check whether he had a standard procedure for rescued animals. The scanner slid over Luke's small body, and, to surprise, a signal rang. Emily watched closely, her heart clenched with curiosity mixed with an uncomfortable foreboding. The scanner's beeping to echo in the room, a simple sound carrying the weight of a mystery about to be revealed. Dr. Harris quickly entered the number into the system. The silence that followed was thicker than any words. Then he looked at Emily, with a look that surprise and regret. "Luke has a record, it belonged to someone." Emily felt a lump in her throat. She had always imagined that was just another lost cub, born on the streets, fighting alone from the beginning. But now, the reality was even more. He had not started his life in solitude. He had been abandoned by someone who once called him family. The registered was in a distant city, kilometers away. The previous owner's name on the screen, along with a phone number. Emily felt her heart race, but it wasn't from anxiety. It was from indignation. Could anyone look at that little cub, so helpless, and simply discard him as if he were a burden? But the microchip reveal wasn't just a detail about past. It was an open wound, a reminder that he was not forgotten. He was left behind. The clinic was silent for a moment, everyone digesting the information. Emily looked at Luke, who was now sleeping peacefully, breathing better than had in the previous days. He didn't know his past had been discovered. For him, what mattered was the present, the warmth, the gentle touch of someone who would never leave him. She took a deep breath and said in a firm voice, "His past doesn't matter anymore. What is now? And now he has me." Emily knew that abandonment had left invisible marks on Luke, scars that cold and hunger had failed to erase. But she knew that love and patience could heal what abandonment tried to destroy. Because at the end of the day, the past may tell a story, but love the ending. Have you ever imagined meeting someone face to face who, with one decision, almost erased a life? Emily never thought she would through this, but fate seemed to have other plans. Luke's past, which she believed was buried beneath layers of suffering, was about to knock on her door in an unexpected and painful way. After the microchip, Luke's former owner, the name Jason, kept echoing in Emily's mind. The address was there, the phone number too. She hesitated, for part of her wanted to leave the past where it was. After all, Luke had suffered enough. But there was another part, the one driven indignation and a burning desire to understand. How could anyone do that? Emily knew she wouldn't get an answer that made sense, but needed to face the truth. So she called. The phone rang a few times before an indifferent male voice answered. "Hello?" Emily took a deep, her heart pounding. "Hi, I'm calling about Luke, the dog you registered. I found him in critical condition, abandoned a cardboard box, almost frozen to death." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Not a silence filled with regret, or but a cold, indifferent emptiness. The kind of silence that seems to echo louder than any words could ever sound. Felt the phone weigh heavy in her hands, as if every unanswered second added to the weight of anger and disbelief growing inside her. Then, finally, voice came, dry, devoid of any emotion that might indicate remorse or shame. "Ah, that dog?" he said with a drawl, almost lazy tone, as if he trying to remember something unimportant. "I thought he was gone, but honestly it didn't really matter. I moved away and didn't want thee anymore." Those words, simple and cold, hit Emily with a force she hadn't expected. The air around her seemed to have as if the winter outside had invaded the room where she was. His chest tightened, his stomach churned, and his anger in silent waves. She hadn't expected Jason to shed tears of guilt, but that indifference and the complete lack of humanity was she could never be prepared for. Emily instinctively looked at Luke, who was sleeping curled up in a makeshift bed in the corner of the room, his rising and falling in a still fragile but stable breath. The same puppy that days before was on the verge of death inside a cardboard box, with cold and fear. The same puppy that, even having been betrayed in the cruelest way, still found the strength to trust, to fight, to love. She, the lump that was forming in her throat, trying to keep her voice steady, even though her emotions were on the surface. "He almost died," she, her voice coming out lower than she wanted, but carrying an intensity that didn't need volume to be heard. "You could have for a home, you could have done anything but that." On the other side of the line, no pause for reflection, no sigh of regret, just venom distilled with the same coldness he had used to abandon Luke. "It was just a dog. I thought it would turn around." Those words were in punch. There was no shouting, there was no arguing. The impact was in the casual tone, in that came from the mouth of someone who had decided that a life wasn't worth the effort. "Just a dog," Emily repeated in her mind, her heart, her blood pounding in her ears. The silence that followed was not for lack of things to say. It was the silence of someone fighting not to explode, not to allow anger to steal control. She gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned as her gaze fell on Luke again. He still slept innocently, oblivious to the fact that the man on other end of the line had decided that his life was worth no more than the space he occupied. But Emily knew the Luke was much more than just a cub. He was living proof that love is resilient, that hope can bloom in even the most broken. He was a pure soul who had survived the worst of humanity and still managed to offer his best. Taking a breath, Emily finally spoke, not in anger but with a clarity that cut through more than any scream could. "What you dismissed as Juste is the strongest, bravest being I've ever met. He fought harder for his life than you've probably ever fought for." Jason was silent, perhaps expecting a follow-up, an outburst that never came, but had said enough. She didn't need his approval. He didn't need the explanation or the regret that would never come. Those words hung in the air, like blades. It was just a dog. Emily looked at Luke, who was sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bed, already stronger, his chest rising and falling, calm breathing. Just a dog, she thought with a sinking heart. The same dog that had fought death with a strength that humans would never know. The same dog that, with a simple look, could convey more love than a words. Emily hung up the phone without saying anything else. There was nothing to be said for someone who didn't see the other life, but it affected her deeply. She stared at Luke for a long time. He didn't know the phone call, the cold conversation, the person who abandoned him without looking back. He only knew now, the now where he was loved and seen as so much more than just a dog. In the days that followed, Emily realized that reuniting with Luke's past had not been a simple, it was a lesson. Jason's abandonment didn't define Luke. Her love does. The care, affection, the nights she stayed by his side in the hospital, the gentle touch when he trembled in nightmares, that's what defined Luke now. Jason missed the chance to meet the purest and most loyal heart he could have had by his side. Emily, on the other hand, had gained a friend who her every day the true meaning of resilience. Because at the end of the day, the past may leave scars, but it doesn't have power to erase who you become later. Luke wasn't just a survivor, he was living proof that love, true, unconditional, and damn is what truly defines us. Have you ever felt like a presence completely changed the meaning of the word home? Not a place with walls and but a space where the heart rests in peace. That's what Luke became to Emily, not just a rescue dog, but a piece of her heart. Time has passed since the day Emily found Luke in that cardboard box, freezing in the relentless cold. Every day was a small, every breath he took was proof that life can be reborn, even when everything seems lost. At first, Emily thought she was saving, but as the days went by, she realized he was also saving something inside her. She could no longer imagine her mornings, the sound of his little paws touching the floor, her nights without the gentle weight of Luke's body curled next to her on the couch. The connection between them had grown into something greater than could explain. Luke was not just a rescued dog, he was part of her story now, into the small and large moments of her routine. One day, while watching Luke sleeping peacefully in his bed, Emily realized that there were no more fears or hesitations. She already knew what she needed to do. He went to the veterinary clinic and, with a smile, signed the adoption papers. The signature was a simple gesture but full of meaning. It was a promise written in ink, but sealed with kind of love that didn't need contracts. While holding the finished document, Emily looked at Dr. Harris, who had followed the entire from the beginning. "Now he's officially mine," she said, but then smiled, correcting herself. "In fact, he always has." When she got home, Luke welcomed her, wagging his tail with that pure and simple joy that only dogs know how to show. He didn't anything about official roles or adoption. What he understood and felt was that he was safe. He was at home. Emily knelt down, hugged Luke, whispered in his ear, "You will never know abandonment again, never again." And at that moment, without needing words, Luke responded in only way he knew how, with a look full of gratitude, loyalty and unconditional love that only those who have been lost know how to. In the course of time, Luke transformed into something that once seemed the fragile, scared and broken puppy, the one who trembled with fear and cold in a cardboard box, was a dog full of life, energy and a contagious joy that seemed to radiate wherever he went. It was as if, with each new day, he left behind the scars of abandonment, replacing them with memories of love and security. Emily and Luke became inseparable. They shared a life built on a bond that didn't need words to be understood. Mornings began with long walks outside, where ran freely, ears flapping in the wind, tail wagging in pure happiness. That vibrant energy felt like a silent celebration of the second chance had been given. In the afternoons, Luke loved curling up next to Emily on the warmth of his body, offering a quiet comfort that no pillow could replace. They watched movies together. Emily often caught Luke watching her with that look only dogs can give, a look full of unconditional love, a daily reminder that she had saved a life. He had saved hers too. On difficult days when the world felt a little heavier, Emily found peace in simply lying next to Luke, feeling the steady of his breathing. He was the kind of silent companion who said everything without needing to make a sound. And for Luke, Emily was safe haven he never knew he needed, but now couldn't live without. They made memories on trails, picnics in parks, lazy afternoons and even rainy days shared under the same blanket. Every moment, no matter how simple, was a reminder that true love is found in the little things, in the gentle touch, in the watchful eye, in the constant presence. Years later, on one of sunny days perfect for a walk, Emily and Luke were in the park where they used to walk. The sky was blue, the air was fresh, and Luke ran exploring every corner, sniffing the world with the curiosity of a dog who finally knew what it was like to live without fear. They were side by side when, as they turned onto a familiar trail, Emily saw a familiar figure in the distance. Her heart beat faster, not with joy, with unexpected recognition. Era Jason. He was sitting on a bench, absent-mindedly looking at his cell phone. Emily paused for a brief moment, the past her mind like a flash. The connection, the cold words, the contempt that almost cost Luke his life. Luke also stopped. For a second, his met Jason's. Time seemed to slow down, as if the world had gone silent. Jason looked at Luke, and for a brief moment, there was a flash of maybe he remembered the fragile, disposable cub he had left to die, maybe not. But Luke remembered. And that's when something that Emily would never forget. Luke simply wagged his tail lightly. No fear, no anger, no regrets. Just a simple, serene, as if to say, "I'm fine now." He then continued walking, confident, healthy and happy, without looking back. Because the past no longer defined he was. Abandonment did not define him. Suffering did not define him. Love defined him. The present defined him. Looked at Jason one last time. She didn't need to say anything. The man who once considered Luke just a dog was now faced with a being who, with a presence, demonstrated more dignity than he ever would have. They continued walking, the sound of Luke's footsteps echoing softly beside her. Smiled, feeling light at heart. "Come on, my boy," she whispered, stroking his head. "What matters is here on my side." And as the sun shone, the path ahead, Emily knew with absolute certainty that the past didn't need answers, when the present was living proof that love always wins. Have you stopped to think about how a single life can touch so many others? Emily never imagined that the small act of stopping to look inside a box could trigger such a profound change, not just in Luke's life, but in around him. Luke wasn't just a rescue dog, he was a symbol, a silent emblem of resilience, overcoming and the unbreakable strength that even the most wounded hearts. As time passed, Emily and Luke's story began to spread, first among close, then to family, and eventually even to strangers. People heard about the puppy who was in the cold, found close to death, and who against all odds chose to live. But what touched people most was not the story of the rescue. That was what came next. The rebirth, the love, the bond that formed between two beings in different ways, needed each other to heal. Emily found herself telling Luke's story more times than she count. At family gatherings, in casual conversations in the park, even to strangers who to pet him on a walk. Every time she spoke, there was a sparkle in her eyes, a reflection of gratitude that words could never describe. People were moved, not just by Luke's journey, but because his story stirred something in everyone, the universal feeling of wanting to be seen, to be saved, to be loved. It was a reminder that in the darkest situations, a simple gesture of compassion can change everything. Sometimes all a life needs to flourish is for to decide to stop and look. Some of Emily's friends, inspired by Luke's story, began adopting abandoned other people, even if they were unable to adopt, began to look at street dogs differently with more empathy, because now they saw an animal alone. They didn't just see a stray dog, and they saw a possible Luke waiting for his chance. But Luke's impact didn't stop. He also changed Emily in ways she never expected. He taught that healing comes not just from saving, but also from being. He showed that love does not need conditions, plans, or guarantees. True love happens in the little things, in the gentle touch of hand, in a silent look that says, "I am here." Luke was more than a survivor. He was an inspiration that even when the world breaks us, we can still find a reason to carry on. Years have passed, but the bond between Emily and never weakened. On the contrary, over time it only grew stronger, rooted in each memory shared, in each look, in each heartbeat that pulsed in tune with the other. The trauma of abandonment is behind us, not because it was forgotten, but because was overcome. The scars Luke bore, visible and invisible, became part of his story, not as symbols of pain, but as medals of resistance. That once existed has been replaced by a life full of love, security, and adventure. They lived countless moments together. Walks in the sun, runs parks, lazy afternoons at home. Every small gesture, every simple routine was a silent celebration of the journey they shared. Emily loved Luke's sleep. His body relaxed without the slightest trace of insecurity, a stark contrast to the scared, frozen pup she encountered years. But the bond between them went beyond physical company. They were soulmates. There was a silent understanding between two, something words could never explain. Emily could just look at Luke and know how he felt. And Luke, with simple tilt of his head or a deep look, seemed to read Emily's soul. They were survivors of their own battles, each carrying their scars but strengthen each other. Emily has faced difficult days over the years, times of uncertainty, loss, personal challenges. Luke was always there, his silent, constant presence offering comfort in a way no one else could. And as Luke grew older, his steps slower and his speckled with white fur, their love remained the same. Her ass might jiggle with less vigor, but the sparkle in Luke's eyes at Emily never changed. Emily knew that time was relentless, but the love they built was eternal, because true love is not measured in years. It is in moments, in memories, in feelings that time cannot erase. In the end, Emily didn't just save Luke, Luke also saved her. He taught her that love is loyal, courageous, and most of all, unbreakable. Have you noticed how a simple decision can transform a life? Emily Luke's story reminds us that often the real impact is in the small gestures, stopping, looking, caring. If, in some way, this story made you reflect on the strength of love and resilience, then it fulfilled its role. Now you can be part of this too. By liking video and subscribing to the channel, you help this message reach more hearts, inspiring other people to see the value of a life, whatever may be. And tell me in the comments, what word defines what you felt while following this journey? Write unbreakable if you also believe true love is stronger than any adversity. But it doesn't stop here. The next story is already waiting for you. Even more intense emotions and lessons that will touch your heart in a unique way. Press play and continue this journey with us, because in the end, the stories that connect us, and you're part of them.